Great. Well, it's 10 o'clock. I've hit record. So welcome all and thank you for joining us. I know that there's still people coming in, but I'll just go through a few preliminaries before we get to the main event, which is our wonderful speakers today. So welcome to our first webinar in the 2021 series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anne Single from the Patient Voice Initiative. Today I'm joining you from Brisbane, and I would like to acknowledge our traditional custodians, the Yagara and the Turrbal, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Normally our chair, Jessica Bean, would be here to welcome you all, but we're very pleased to give her the morning off today. For those of you who don't know Jessica, she's not only our very hands-on chair, she's a cystic fibrosis patient and a patient advocate. And if we do things a bit different at Patient Voice and think a little bit differently, that's because it's that very experienced patient perspective that guides our work. So today my co-host is Dr. Simon Pfeiffer from Community and Patient Preferences Research, Capri. Hi, Simon.
Hi, everyone. How you going?
Simon is on our advisory committee, and he and Laurie Axford have been giving us a huge amount of their time and intellect since the very early days of Patient Voice, even before it became Patient Voice, and a lot of in-kind support over the years too. So thank you once again for that, Simon and Laurie. So today we're going to have some short presentations from our guest speakers, Dr. Janelle Bowden and Dr. Amanda Ruth, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions. As with last year, everyone is welcome to listen in, but please understand we make these events for patients, their loved ones and patient groups. And so if you're not asking a question as a patient or a patient representative, we just ask that you identify yourself from where you are from in the chat, and that just helps us to prioritize the questions of patients and their families and groups, but it doesn't mean we won't answer your question. We'll try and answer all the questions. So for those of you who don't know Patient Voice Initiative, just briefly, we're a multi-stakeholder initiative led by our patient chair, Jessica Bean. We really value collaborating to achieve our aim, which is that patients are heard and valued in the Australian health system. And we do this by connecting patients to essential resources, initiatives like today, which are designed to build capacity and also to promote involvement. And we were able to do events like today for free, thanks to our wonderful sponsors, as well as the in-kind support we receive from Capri and Rare Cancers Australia. I want to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. Some people have been saying, hey, our Patient Voice Initiative getting into the clinical trials research space? No, not really at all. Some of you will recall that in 2018, 2019, our workshops focused on patient input. That knowledge that patient groups and patients bring to health technology assessment. And in 2020, we focused on patient-based evidence, that robust research into patients' needs, preferences, and experiences that uses established methodologies. And so it was sort of a natural progression that people were asking us more about the traditional evidence used in the process to reimburse new medicines and treatments, and think about what patient knowledge means to it, how it's done, and how patients interpret the evidence that goes into the field of health technology assessment. And when I say health technology assessment, I'm just talking about the process that sits behind guiding decisions about what treatments are reimbursed through our Medicare system. And so I'm pleased today to welcome Janelle and Amanda. They come with a wealth of expertise and also a real passion for the patient voice. They're also incredibly in demand, particularly with clinical trials months and budgets and so forth. So I'm very pleased and grateful to have them here. So briefly, the way this session will work is we'll record it and post it on our YouTube channel just as soon as we've corrected the subtitles. Our speakers will each have 15 to 20 minutes to speak, And when they speak, can I just ask you to make sure you turn off your video and make sure you're on mute? That just helps because at the 20-minute mark, I plan to appear on the screen just to remind them that it's time to wrap up if they haven't done so already. And then we should have plenty of time for your questions. And so what I'd like you to do is when you think of a question, throw it into the chat box and we'll go through them systematically after the speakers. So our first speaker is Dr. Janelle Bowden. Janelle is a scientist by training, a clinical trials professional of 20 years plus, and a passionate advocate for clinical trials and the consumer voice in research and therapeutic development. She's worked for commercial and non-commercial clinical trial sponsors and sites as an employee, consultant, and entrepreneur in Australia and overseas. Janelle currently provides consultancy and contract services through AccessCR to support clients with clinical research and consumer engagement interests. She's actively advocates for issues important to consumers in research and volunteers in various capacities to support consumer awareness, participation, and involvement in clinical research. And after Janelle, we'll hand over to Dr. Amanda Ruth. Amanda joined Rare Cancers Australia as the Head of Policy and Public Affairs in 2019. She is also the Executive Director of the National Oncology Alliance, a non-incorporated, not-for-profit, multi-stakeholder group of cancer experts, which was founded by Rare Cancers in 2018. Amanda's held leadership roles in market access, policy, and government affairs in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors, having worked for over 15 years in multinational pharmaceuticals and medical device companies, including Celgene, BMS, J&J, and Eli Lilly. Amanda also has extensive consultancy experience, having had a leadership role in the health economics and social policy team for Deloitte Access Economics. Amanda's PhD from the Centre for Inflammatory Diseases, Monash University, is in immunology. Welcome, Amanda and Janelle. And Janelle, I'll just go through the laborious process of handing over the slides to you.
Thanks, Anne. Oops, wrong screen. Let me know if you can see my slides there.
They're not yet.
Sorry, there we go. Oops.
Great, we can see them now. So I'm going to turn my mic off and my camera off.
So good morning, everyone. And thanks to Anne and Jessica for the invitation to talk about something I'm pretty passionate about, which is clinical trials and patient involvement in them. There will be a bit of jargon today, so if I don't explain it or explain it well, please just pop a note into the chat and I'm happy to cover it off in question time. So I'm presenting today from Sydney and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I live and work on, the Wallumedegal clan, as well as those that have cared for generations for the lands from which each of you joined today. I acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, sea and community and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar today. So Anne gave me a pretty ambitious list of topics to cover in a really short time today. So I am going to use some notes to try and help me keep on track to time. I plan therapeutics to kind of inform that latter process that Patient Voice Initiative and its community is so interested in. I'll also talk a little bit about why companies might or might not run trials, why they fail, how clinical trials contribute to the information regulatory and payers use in their decision making. And I'll also share why and how it's important, I think, that clinical trials are designed with patients. So let's start with a definition. So we have a common understanding of what clinical trials are. And this is the one used by the World Health Organization. A trial is any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate their effects on health outcomes. A couple of important words here are prospectively, so it's forward-looking. And the other important word is that of intervention, so something is actually done, which is why they are sometimes called interventional trials or studies. And there are all sorts of interventions, not just drugs and devices, but diagnostics, exercise, diet, behavioural or psychological methods. And actually less than half the trials that happen in Australia involve drugs and devices. The other thing to say is that not all trials are treatment trials. Sometimes they're about preventing something, screening for something, or exploring better supportive care. So for the purposes of today's webinar and the interests of Patient Voice Initiative, I'm going to focus on trials that involve medicines. In Australia, there's a number of overarching guidelines, standards and legislation that guide the way that clinical trials are conducted, which are kind of outlined here. I'm not going to go into them all in detail other than to say that the national statement requires ethical review and approval of studies before people are recruited. And the note for guidance on good clinical practice, which is sometimes called GCP, is an international standard to which regulators expect drug trials to commit. The ISO standard is the equivalent of GCP for medical devices. And what's important is that GCP assigns various stakeholders in the process responsibilities. I mention these only so that you have some awareness of the terminology you might come across and the relationships between different parts of the process. So to begin with, a sponsor. They're an organisation or network or even an individual who takes on the full responsibility for a trial, for its funding, design, conduct, analysis and reporting. They can work with other collaborators and service providers like contract research organisations and will assign monitors to oversee trial sites led by investigators where data is collected. The investigators, who are usually a clinician or a researcher, and not the sponsors, are actually responsible for seeking and maintaining ethics approval. The sponsor is the one that talks to the regulator, which is represented here in grey because they're not directly involved in the conduct of studies and so don't have actual responsibilities under GCP. For time reasons, I'm not going to spend too much more time on the basics, but I did want to point out that there are a range of publicly available resources if you want more information about trials. And I believe Anne is going to put links to these in the chats. And as Anne mentioned, it's clinical trials, International Clinical Trials done next week. So this month, there's actually lots of events going on to raise awareness and understanding of clinical trials and plenty of opportunities to learn more. So look out for those. So let's look at the pathway now for how a new drug is developed. First is a discovery phase. New molecules are generated and screened for their potential. Those with potential will then go into the preclinical phase. And this is the phase where lab and animal research is done to better understand, for example, mechanisms of action, toxicity, stability, and impact on cellular and body systems. And if that data and other commercial factors, which we'll talk to in a moment, stack up, a molecule might proceed into clinical trials, which is also called the clinical development phase. If the trials work as anticipated and there's no other red flags, then a company will submit for regulatory approval. And more studies may be done after approval for reasons I will mention in a moment. Overall, the process typically takes 10 to 15 years from bench to bedside. It's expensive and the probability of success is pretty low. So if we look a little closer at the clinical development pathway, for a drug, there are typically 4 phases of clinical trials, noting that innovations in trial design and regulatory pathways are starting to mix things up a bit. So typically phase 1 studies are the first time a drug will be used in humans. Typically, these trials will involve exposing a small number of healthy people, usually males, to increasing doses to understand what it does in and to the body, its safety and its tolerability. Participants are often reimbursed for their time and inconvenience because they're often stuck in hospital, and they'll usually experience no benefit. And of the 10 compounds which enter this phase, about 6 might survive. Once a safe dose has been established, it'll go on to phase 2. And these are essentially proof of concept trials. Will it work and be safe in the target population? And about a third of these drugs will proceed to phase 3. Phase 3 are the important big confirmatory studies, typically involving thousands of people. Does it work? Is it safe? And importantly, how does it compare with current best practice standard care? About half of drugs will fail this stage, for some of the reasons we'll talk about in a moment. But what's important about these phase 3 trials is that the eligibility criteria and the protocols are going to inform the limits of the approval for the drug. That is its label. Who can use it, when and how much. Because trials can quite often have narrow eligibility criteria, it can lead to seemingly narrow approvals. And eventual off-label use often happens once clinicians get experience with the products. So that's why there's often phase 4 studies done post-approval. These studies will collect extra safety information, usually at the request of regulatory agencies, or can look at more real-world use of the drug by broadening eligibility criteria. They could also be observing who's actually using it and what the safety is like when it's used in that way. And the results of these trials can spark ideas for new indications or broadening the label around the population that can use it. In many cases, companies will need to go back to phase 2 and 3 studies to explore those opportunities. So why do trials fail? There's multiple reasons. It could be because they weren't designed well. The assumptions were wrong, the wrong data was collected, the analysis was designed in a way that missed something. Perhaps sample size was insufficient to show an effect. Wrong sites might have been selected. Maybe they were unable to recruit or provided poor quality data. Recruitment may have failed or too many people dropped out. And this is actually a frequent problem with 80% of trials failing to recruit within their planned timelines, and often even 20 to 30% of trials failing to recruit to target at all. Those reduced sample sizes caused by poor recruitment and dropouts can impact on the ability of a trial to detect differences between treatment groups or reach a conclusion. Perhaps there are safety events that stop a trial early or prevent new trials starting. Or maybe they're poorly executed. There's protocol violations, they run out of money, there are quality issues and poor oversight. But if a trial is failing, it's not the only reason, a trial failing is not the only reason a product may be discontinued through the development life cycle. There are lots of factors companies can take into consideration in whether to start a trial, to continue trials, or to seek approval and reimbursement for a drug. They can be commercial in nature. Is the product aligned with the long-term strategy of the company or a recent merger? Is there a patient need? Are there payers who will enable a return on the investment? What's the competition? There are practical issues like, can a trial be designed cost effectively to deliver the evidence regulators want? Does the company have the experience, people, time, relationships, systems to support the trial? Do they have enough cash? It can be a real risk for new companies or those that don't have many products generating revenue. But the product itself, can they manufacture enough in a form people are willing to take? Is it stable? Does it require storage conditions that will make distribution and use impractical? Are there intellectual property or licensing considerations? The reality is, for a pharmaceutical company to support a product through clinical development, the business case needs to stack up, not just the technology or the patient need. At the end of the day, trials for new therapeutics are run to gain regulatory approval and have someone pay for them. Regulators are looking for information about quality and safety, efficacy, availability, and increasingly patient need. Clinical trials provide evidence of safety and efficacy in the indication requested. Payers will take into consideration a lot more factors, things like cost effectiveness, strength of data, and affordability. And clinical trials can provide the evidence for some of those areas that I've highlighted in the darker text, assuming they have been designed with the end in mind. In Australia, the TGA typically first becomes aware of trials when a sponsor notifies them that they want to start to run a trial. Unlike overseas jurisdictions, the TGA isn't necessarily involved in shaping what trials companies need to run and what endpoints or outcomes might need to be measured. For that reason, global trials may not always deliver the evidence that the TGA might be looking for an indication, which can contribute to why our approvals may be different to those overseas. So let's turn our mind to the role of patients can play in clinical trials, because as valuable as it is and as needed as it is, participating is not the only way to contribute. Like most industries that for many years have consulted their product end users, it's being increasingly recognised the value that involving patients can have to the clinical development pipeline. So what's driving this change? Well, it starts with patients themselves. I'm sure you've heard and perhaps used the statement, "Nothing about us without us." Well connected, empowered with information and looking for answers, patients are asking for a place at the table. And when they don't have it, they're increasingly building the table for themselves. Funders of research are wanting to see that patients are involved in research as a way of ensuring their dollars are spent where they are needed, that it's not just good science, but the science is grounded in what matters to end users. Journals like the British Medical Journal are starting to request information about how patients could have contributed to research. Researchers, perhaps driven by outside forces like funders and journals, are taking their leap, seeing their research from a different perspective and discovering the benefits of partnering to improve their research success. Regulatory authorities are increasingly taking into consideration patient experiences and needs when assessing whether a product works, is safe, and is fit for purpose. And so industry, needing to improve regulatory success and reimbursement, are engaging with patients earlier in the development life cycle. It also makes financial sense because patient input throughout the life cycle can help avoid pitfalls that cost time and money. So what are the opportunities for patients to input across that life cycle? This is a really busy slide, so you might want to kind of go and look at it later. But essentially it outlines a number of key activities patients and patient groups can contribute to across the development life cycle. And these contributions can happen in various ways, from light touch consultations on participant materials for a specific trial, to being embedded partnership in the strategy and oversight and governance of research programs and specific trials. Neither companies or patients always have the time and resources to undertake every one of these activities on every project. And so for that reason, a prioritisation tool has been developed by City to help sponsors and patient groups identify the engagement activities for a specific project that they believe will provide the most benefit for least investment and lead to more meaningful win-win partnerships. And so while the last slide looked at the entire development pathway, this one looks to showcase some of the opportunities within the life cycle of a single research project. In the early days, patients might contribute their ideas through surveys, focus groups, or previous research. They might help explore and prioritise ideas and contribute to grant applications, or help drive what research happens through their participation in grant review processes. As a trial gets set up, patients can be involved in trial scientific or steering committees, intimately involved in protocol development and oversight of a trial. They can provide input or review documentation of systems and procedures, especially those that are patient-facing. For example, for relevance, for language, or for burden. Consumers may be involved in training events like investigator meetings, or be quite independent to the study, providing input as members of a human research ethics committee to the review and approval of projects. Once recruitment kicks off, consumers can be instrumental in creating awareness of trials, supporting recruitment, providing peer support. They can help in data collection, for example, in the collection of qualitative data, as sometimes patients will say to another peer what they wouldn't say to a clinician. Patients may be part of data safety monitoring boards, providing a patient perspective to risk-benefit discussions and reviews of adverse events. What might be clinically acceptable may not be acceptable from a patient quality of life experience, thereby impacting later acceptability and use of a product. And as the trial wraps up, patients can provide real-life context to the interpretation of results, increasing their credibility or involved in the preparation and dissemination of information to both lay audiences and regulatory authorities. And to find these opportunities, you need to start with the relationships you have through your patient groups, through your own clinicians, through the contacts of your contacts. Most of the people I know that have started contributing to research have done so because they've asked rather than been asked. And as your experience grows, typically so will the offers to get involved. So for that reason, being mindful of burnout and self-care are important. And here are the types of questions that patients can help answer and the potential impact of that input. Are we researching the right thing? Are we using the right comparators? Are the eligibility criteria reflective of the target population, or are they going to exclude people? Do patients perceive the risk and benefits differently to the researchers or company? Is the protocol too impractical, burdensome, and logistically possible from a patient perspective? Are we collecting information on the outcomes that matter to patients, and are they relevant? Are we communicating information effectively to participants? Are patient information and consent forms readable? Is the language for particular assessments understandable? What do patients want to know during a study? And are results accessible, understandable, and contextualized for participants? How do patients weigh the safety information in the context of their conditions? And are the results relevant to patients? The answers to all these questions can potentially impact timelines, cost, recruitment, retention, data quality, and ultimately implementation of results, whether that be to clinical practice, to the next research project, or to regulatory success and reimbursement for that product. In wrapping up, I do want to acknowledge that how much information I've just provided to you, particularly if you're new to clinical trials. In case it's all a bit of a blur, here are the few key messages I hope you'll take away from today. The first is that clinical trials provide the evidence about what works for whom and how safe it is. Clinical trials inform healthcare practice and research, but also the regulators assessing whether or not to approve a new product or not, and those facilitating access through reimbursement. The input of the target population for a product is valuable to the design and conduct of trials, potentially improving relevance, recruitment, retention, data quality, reducing time and costs, and ultimately improving regulatory success. There are lots of opportunities to get involved with varying levels of commitment and time to input into clinical trials and the product development lifecycle. And if you're interested, start hitting up your networks for those opportunities. The regulatory environment is rapidly evolving and patient input is being embedded into these processes. Now is really the time for patient groups and advocates to consider how they might upskill and contribute to improve the trials, products, and outcomes for those that they help. So I'd like to say thanks to everybody for listening and coming along on that journey with me. There's lots of ways to contact me if you want to, and I'll hand back to Anne.
Oh, thank you so much, Janelle. That was absolutely fascinating and just so much for us to follow up on there. No, it's wonderful. And you did an amazing job squeezing that all my questions into such a short period. So thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Amanda now. Amanda, have I successfully made you a co-host so you can share your screen?
I think so. So before I share my screen, though, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm residing upon in Melbourne here today, the Bunurong people, and as well as the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and future, and extend respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be online today. So I'll now proceed to try and share my screen with you. Is that working?
I think it's just about to come on. Yes, now we can see it. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, great. So thanks very much, Janelle. That's a tough act to follow, and we'll see a little bit of repetition in the types of slides that I'm presenting, but hopefully I can put a different lens on it from the perspective of working for Rare Cancers Australia, and also in consideration of a lot of the patients that we support with our patient support team that have sort of aggressive and late stage cancers. So the question that I'm sort of considering in back of mind today is whether clinical trials are really designed with patients in mind. So as Janelle talked about, quite simplistically, from my perspective, clinical trials are very scientific and academic, and they're designed to test new treatments or interventions. They're not really designed as a treatment option for patients, but from the perspective of the work that we do, and I do every day with my colleagues, clinical trials are becoming the standard of care for people with advanced cancers, particularly in the case where more cancers are becoming rare through the discovery of rare genomic subtypes. So as Janelle talked about, clinical trials must conform to ethical principles before patients can be recruited to clinical trials. And typically what we find through our experience is that patients aren't really involved in the fundamental trial design, but sometimes do have a voice, or sometimes we are asked to give our perspective after these trials have gone through the ethics process. And often this point in time is really too late. It's a time to make maybe slight changes, but it's not in the original conception of the trial. And also our patients have an urgent need. So they have an urgent need to be recruited to trials. There's not often the time to consider prospectively, design of trials that are going to benefit them directly. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about investigator-initiated trials today and the opportunity there, as well as Janelle touched a lot on commercial trials, which I'm more familiar with given my background. But just to go over this slightly again, so commercial trials are run by our pharmaceutical industry and medical technology industries, with the aim in mind of having therapies or interventions available in the market and to be sold and make a commercial profit. And obviously patients are an important part of that. They are the recipients of treatments, but really there is, a commercial focus, and not saying that people at pharmaceutical companies don't care about patients, they do. And there's a greater focus from industry on the importance of patients, and as Janelle said, somehow patient involvement. But ultimately, the limitation is that the companies must design the trials in the way that delivers what the regulators need and what the reimbursement bodies are looking for. And the objectives of this don't often align with patients or patient reported outcomes, for example. So within, there's also limitations within the time in which patients can have access, because often phase 2 research may be shown to be beneficial to patients, but it's not sufficient to gain reimbursement or funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So investigator-led trials are really important, and they're really important in Australia because what they do is they do something that I think commercial trials don't do. They give the ability to put the clinician lens on on the use of a particular therapy and to understand in more detail who exactly is going to benefit from treatment and how. So it's once the product typically is commercially available and we can explore if there are certain types of people that may respond better to treatment, if there are certain patients for whom treatment may be ineffective or harmful. So they provide a lot of value. They also provide a treatment opportunity, again, for patients that may not have other options. These are initiated by clinicians and investigators as part of a clinical centre or clinical networks. They are often in collaboration with multinational companies, such as pharmaceutical companies, that can help fund them. They're not traditionally used for reimbursement or to support funding applications, which is a great shame. So Janelle's already gone through the phases of the clinical trial, so I won't really focus on that, but only to say that our reimbursement system and our model of funding therapies in Australia is based on phase 3 clinical trial research. It's based on a model that accepts phase 3 clinical trial research as being sort of the ideal standard. And unfortunately, as we are moving into an era of more personalised therapies, particularly in a lot of disease areas, but also particularly cancer and rare cancers, this sort of fundamental idealistic phase 3 clinical trial becomes a barrier that is or a goal that's hard to obtain and uphold. It's almost impossible in many respects, given the nature of treatment and also the nature of disease, particularly cancer. And not to underestimate the brilliance of some of our, researchers that are constantly adapting clinical methodology and research methodology. There are adaptations to fundamental clinical trials, such as these different types of trials within cancer that have been designed for genomic technologies. So I'm not going to go into too much detail around it. You can see it's a very complicated picture, but there are things called basket trials that aim to use one therapy in many different cancers. So that's great for patients. Platform trials where there are several treatments or interventions at once compared to a control group, and there's flexibility with sub-studies underneath that original platform study, and umbrella trials where multiple targeted treatments for patients with the same cancer are split into different subgroups based on their molecular cancer characteristics. So it starts to get extremely complicated. On a positive note, clinical trials do create opportunities, not only for patients, but also for economic activity. And there are lots of downstream events. You may have listened to the release of the health budget recently, a couple of days ago, where Minister Hunt again announced a contribution from the government to clinical and medical research of $6.7 billion over the next 4 years. And $2.4 billion of that is directly allocated to the Medical Research Future Fund, so clinical trials. And luckily for us, 70 million of that is dedicated to research in rare cancers and rare diseases. And part of the reason for that is obviously to stimulate a healthy nation and stimulate a healthy economy and create jobs. So as you can see from this slide, this is a picture that's been taken from an MTP Connect report from 2017, but the same sort of principles hold true, that clinical trials can create obviously improvement in health outcomes for patients, and improve the standard of care and increase our knowledge, but also contribute to ongoing employment, avoid healthcare costs through conduct of the trial itself, because the trial therapies are funded, and they have multiplier effects throughout their sort of contribution and impact upon the economy. But there are also pitfalls associated with clinical trials, and they are not often designed with people in mind at the forefront and centre, particularly those that, as Janelle rightly pointed out, are the trials that lead to definition of how a therapy can be used in the market, because it is dependent on commercialisation and dependent on large global multinational companies. So when these trials are designed, they're not thinking about the Australian population, they're not thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they're not thinking about people that live in rural and remote regions. They're thinking about the largest populations, which may be populations within the US or Europe. And therefore, even though, as Janelle pointed out, there's opportunity potentially, sort of more of a subtle opportunity from an industry perspective, I think, for patients to be involved in some of these sort of feedback mechanisms, there is quite a big limitation in actually having a reach and an impact from a patient level when you're considering design of a global trial. Even from a company perspective, from my history of working within industry, as an Australian industry person, it's difficult to try and have an impact as an Australian on behalf of what's required from a regulatory and reimbursement point of view. So it has to be even harder for patients. And hopefully, we can work towards changing that, but there's a lot of barriers to overcome. Some of the pitfalls, I think, can patients, I'm just reading what I've got here, patients provided, there's a very defined treatment opportunity for patients. So as Janelle pointed out, the criteria to be included in a trial is extremely strict and very well defined. And that's very problematic for patients because it means that a lot of patients who may benefit from a particular therapy will miss out because of the very tight inclusion criteria. So it's extremely hard for you to be even eligible for a trial if you're lucky enough to find one. And unfortunately, within commercial trials, they're often designed at later stages of disease when they're for new interventions. So, for example, for advanced cancers and who in people that have had multiple lines of therapy, so they've exhausted many treatments. This means that the maximum clinical benefit that is able to be achieved by that person is extremely diminished compared to if you were be able to have that therapy very early on in your cancer, for example. So these are some of the real limitations, and there are ways that we could look at addressing this to make it to create bigger opportunities for people, and we really need to think about that. But clinical trials do provide hope of longer survival for, like I said, a limited number of cancer patients. We can do better. And sometimes the clinical trial opportunity means that because a lot of trials are run globally from a commercial point of view, when it comes to investigating a new intervention, that patients have to go abroad to be treated, and that's what we do a lot. Is support from Rare Cancers is support people to go overseas to get treatment, which is to say it's less than ideal really doesn't justify what that means to someone to have to try and not only fund their treatment itself or to fund traveling, but just the emotional and physical toll that it can take on a very sick person having to go overseas and leave their support networks. Again, clinical trials, sort of the pitfalls, I suppose. Janelle touched on the fact that the barrier of entry for an intervention is for it to be registered for use within Australia through the TGA. And once it goes through this process, it's not funded for use. So there are other bodies that are involved in funding that we mentioned. the government is involved in funding, and there are other committees that are involved in evaluating whether a therapy should be funded or not funded, and what the willingness to pay is for that particular therapy. But often new cancer interventions are funded for a select cancer subtype or type that we talked about. And limitation is that a therapy may be able to be of benefit to many different types of cancers, but our system at the moment doesn't allow equity of use across different cancers. It's really dependent on the design of the clinical trial. So the design of the clinical trial really is dictating who will be potentially able and eligible to receive that treatment in the future. And even though companies do their best to investigate other, for example, other cancer types, it would just take years and years and years for other patients to get access while they wait for these subsequent clinical trials to be completed. So it's really a problem for patients. It means that a lot of patients die and don't get the treatment that they could otherwise get that may be of benefit to them. And I suppose one of the, when we think about patient rights, which we're doing at Rare Cancers at the moment, we're exploring that this year, what we find is that there's really not a lot of room to move from a clinical perspective for a physician. So physicians will become familiar with using, a particular therapy for cancer, and they may believe in their clinical opinion that the therapy may be beneficial to another patient, but that therapy isn't reimbursed or available on the PBS, for example, and they can find by that, and they're not able to use it for another patient who may benefit. So the question that we sort of raise is, when does clinical opinion matter? When should physicians be given the right to make an informed clinical choice once a therapy is considered safe and effective and of high quality, as Janelle pointed out, through the registration process? When can physicians determine and take into account all the medical training and expertise they have using a medication to give it to somebody else? And at the moment, that's a bit of a pitfall it's a huge pitfall within our health system. And it means that some people, and a lot of people, just fall through the cracks. So one of the questions we're exploring is, do all patients have the right to treatment? And at the moment, we believe that they do, but the right's not realised. Also, do all patients have the right to know whether a clinical trial might be available for them as a treatment option? I think, what we find is that there is a really big inequity in this area as well. Patients aren't informed as readily as we would like about their alternative options. And again, as I mentioned, when it comes to cancer, it's very aggressive and late stage. We often talk to patients that are quite desperate and have been told there are no options for them. How do they find out about clinical trials, or whether in fact they could be eligible for one here or overseas? And there's other complications that go along with that road to clinical trials as well. Once patients are on a clinical trial, do they even realise that they have the right to stop treatment if it becomes intolerable or it limits their quality of life in a way that they don't find acceptable? As a patient, what's important to you might be different to somebody else. If there's an aggressive sort of side effect, the benefit that you're getting from the actual treatment might not be worth enduring that side effect. The other question that we're thinking about, are patients supported when they enter a clinical trial program, and when they exit a clinical trial program? Are they given clear options for next steps and appropriate psychological support and guidance? And from our experience, our patient support team would probably say they're not. And we're very lucky that we have fabulous patient navigators within our patient support team that help patients, but they can't reach everybody. So there's a real need for more entrenched support. Do patients in clinical trials have the right to have their outcomes and experiences recorded? As Janelle suggested, they do. And this can be through patient-reported outcomes or patient-reported experiences, but these aren't fundamentally included in clinical trials at the moment. I see Anne popping on the screen, so I'll just be 2 more minutes, Anne. Thank you for the reminder. So as I mentioned, Rare Cancers Australia, through our National Oncology Alliance of over 400 stakeholders, is pursuing research and feedback this year to explore the fundamental rights and roles of Australian cancer patients. And so we're calling on anybody on this call, if you're interested on this teleconference, to input into the work that we're doing. We would love you to have your say. You can email me directly or go to our website at www.rarecancers.org.au. And I think Anne will go over this. If you want to find out later, sort of how do I find a clinical trial? Contact your doctor, contact a patient organisation, or look at these various websites. You know, you shouldn't have to find your own clinical trial, but unfortunately, this is the situation we find some of our patients in quite readily. And thank you very much for your time today. It's been delightful to have the opportunity to speak to you. And please contact me with any further questions or queries.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. I really did not want to cut you there because it's just been absolutely fascinating. And together you and Janelle have just given us so much to think about. And I can see from the comments that everyone's really enjoying these presentations. So I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen there. And I'll just ask Simon and Janelle if they want to come on camera. Everyone's welcome to come on camera if you like. We're going to take some of the questions that have come through in our chat. And one of the ones I can see there is from Lillian Lee. And her question says, for Janelle and Amanda, one of the challenges as a patient research advocate working with clinical trials is trying to represent the voices of minority groups, e.g. First Nations people. And I think this is a fascinating question in light of some of the difficulties you just spoke about there. So Janelle or Amanda, do you have tips on how we can do this better?
Amanda, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think one of the things that we're exploring through our roles and rights work is different ways of communicating. So I think to reach different sort of populations, such as, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we need to think about how to communicate different material in different formats that might reach them. So maybe not only written material, maybe you know, video recorded, say video, but we don't use video, you know, recorded imagery, you know, podcasts, things, different media to get through to different people within the population.
Thanks, Amanda. And Janelle, your thoughts on that one?
Lillian, I know that, you know, this is a complicated issue. I think the first thing is to be aware of biases that exist in research. You know, for people who don't natively speak English, clinical trials can be a very difficult proposition for them. And then the added benefit of contributing or involving their experience in those channels that can influence them is difficult. So I know ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, has done a little bit of work in the culturally and linguistically diverse space. I think they're also doing some work in the First Nations space. It starts with people acknowledging the biases that exist in the system, then trying to actively, proactively involve those people. And it's not easy. And what I like to say is that clinical trials are just a subset of what happens in the healthcare system. They're a reflection of what happens in the healthcare system. So it's you fix it for clinical trials, you're probably going to go some way to fixing it in the healthcare system. It's a complicated question. I don't have an easy answer for you.
That's fine. Thank you for that. I think it is a huge issue that we need to just keep on that agenda because we've got to have progress there, haven't we? Janelle, I'm going to come back to you with another quick one, which says, Janelle, I know you do a lot of work trying to get information to patients about clinical trials. How do you think this could be more effective?
Oh, if I had the answer to that, Christine, I wouldn't have spent the last 12 years trying to do it. It starts, I think, with clinician education. Many clinicians have the same beliefs and misconceptions about clinical trials that the rest of the community does. They're also quite time poor. So providing them with space and education to be able to support their patients to participate in clinical trials would be a good start. I think the Australian Clinical Trials government website could be built upon to do a better job. It's something, solving that question is something that literally keeps me up at night. So it's a work in progress, and I have some new ideas, and I'm open to anyone who wants to collaborate on solving that question.
There's a bit of a funny circle there, isn't there, Janelle? Because we know that involving patients in not just as subjects, but in the design of trials probably increases recruitment. But then we've got the work to do with involving the patients.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of work to be done throughout the system. Everyone does their best, but we need to do better for patients and for everyone that's involved in the system, the people trying to run trials as well. It's not easy, but the more that we can collaborate together, the more I think we'll solve these problems together.
And Amanda, I was really struck by that in your presentation. I think you spoke very clearly and helped people understand that gap between what happens in trials and lives here in Australia, and what the consequences of the way the system works across so many facets there. I was really interested in this question from Patricia from the Lung Foundation. So I'll throw that to you firstly, Amanda, which is, could patient-clinician developed shared decision-making aids be a pathway to incorporate rights, risks, and information?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I think yes is the answer to that, but it's about how do we get patients involved early on, and I also, from the perspective of, we talked about, commercial trials and commercial-driven trials, and then investigator-led trials. I think it's easier to achieve through an investigator-led trial. If we're thinking about commercial trials, how do we penetrate sort of the multinational, layers of complexity? And there are opportunities there too. I think the way to approach that is from a really interacting from a global perspective to try and raise the profile of the patient voice and create and sort of almost advocacy around how valuable patient input can be to clinical decision making in the end, but also to commercialization.
Thanks, Amanda. There's some great comments here, so everyone please look at those comments here. I won't have time to read them all out. Matt Soberg has said, are there any implementation lessons from clinical trials from more common cancers compared to rare cancers? So I'm going to ask that one first to you, Amanda, and Janelle, please join at the end if you'd like to add anything to that one.
I think there are implementation lessons. So I suppose trials for common cancers, if you like. Well, first of all, I think, when I think about common cancers, I think we are, for example, if you take breast cancer as a common cancer, there are many subgroups of rare cancers that have been defined through molecular characterization of breast cancer. So, if we think back a number of years ago, original trials were designed on a population basis for very large numbers of people. So you were able to do sort of more extensive comparisons and fit that sort of phase three sort of global golden standard, if you like, of trial research. Whereas now when we look at rare cancers, there are a lot of barriers simply because we're looking at clinical trial populations of 20 people or less. And it's very hard to prove from a scientific or even a statistical point of view, you know, a clinically meaningful difference of effect when you're only considering, for example, 20 patients. But there's also problems with recruitment. You have to consider that even if you're doing global trials, you may never be able to recruit the number of patients that are needed to do those later phase research studies. So the difficulty is in being able to accept what you call from a scientific point of view a lower standard of evidence, so earlier phase research, as sufficient proof that a therapy is good enough to reimburse and it's good enough to be paid for by a regulator or government, for example. And that's the challenge. That's the major stumbling block, is that we're now looking at trials in smaller populations where there is a lot more uncertainty for decision makers, and yet there will never be any more in-depth research that will allow that maturity of data. So decisions need to be made earlier, otherwise cancer patients just miss out.
That's a wonderful confronting note to end on, but a wonderful segue you just did for our next week's webinar. And because we're on the hour, I'm going to take that moment to say that next week we are talking about uncertainties, our webinar. And I just want to flag to people just briefly as we wrap up. I know some people had trouble with the emails for connecting today, and it looks like they do end up in some people's spam boxes. So we've tried to override it manually, but if you know of people having trouble, please get them to email us directly and we'll sort that out. The other thing is, if you're joining for any of our next webinars, just please use your same link. You can use it for each week now, so that will be easier again. And the other thing I wanted to say about next week is we will be hearing from Jo Watson from PBAC and Nicole Millers from Rare Voices Australia about uncertainties. And I think it's a really interesting area to be discussing. But we know we are colliding with the TGA meeting that has just been called in the same spot. So we're just going to look through, see who's got that diary clash, and you can expect just an update to us if we think it's more appropriate to move our session for later in the day, because we just don't want to split people in two. Having said that, all our webinars will be on our YouTube channel. Just as soon as we check that the subtitles are coherent, they will be up there. And so I do just want to wrap up there. There's so many good questions still coming in, and I do think we needed a day on this, but I'm enormously grateful to Amanda and Janelle and Simon as well as Sally Wortley, who's not here today, but in that Consumer Evidence Engagement Unit, who's always really helpful when we're discussing through what our webinar series can do and what sort of issues we can address. And I'm really appreciative to everyone who's joined us this morning. So thank you very much all. I look forward to continuing some of the discussions that came today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.